what do we do? How are we supposed to feel? It's hard not to wrestle as we try to look to the future with some semblance of hope. Well, we can't help but recognize the overwhelming reality. And we've lost something. For some of us, it's easier to name, to identify the reason we feel empty and desperate. For others, though, it's harder to pinpoint. We just know something is off. Something inside the deepest parts of ourselves longs for what was before. We don't really know what to think about what's to come. This is grief. This is a feeling we expect when someone we love passes or a marriage crumbles and slips through our fingers. And while grief is expected in times like those, what we don't actually think, what we never thought we would have to think about, are the situations we find ourselves in now. And we certainly didn't think we'd have to face them alone. In this digitally connected, socially isolated world, it's easy for us to be overwhelmed with grief. Grief over things we never imagined we would lose. Of loved ones. Of physical connection. Of celebrations and careers. The loss of life as we planned it. And what feels like once in a lifetime milestones. We even grieve the loss of innocence as we try to explain to our children a threat we cannot see, a threat we may not even fully understand. How can we reconcile or even begin to think about overcoming something like this?
Grief is one of the most powerful emotions I have ever felt. It permeates every fiber of your being. It dulls things like excitement and joy while heightening the awareness of struggle, hardship, and pain. Job once said, "If only my grief could be weighed and my devastation placed with it on the scales." Job is saying, if only you could see the burden of my grief, you'd understand what I'm carrying. I think this has to be one of the best descriptors I have ever heard. Because grief belongs on a scale. It's heavy. It weighs us down. I know that's certainly true for me. And it's terribly personal. Let me tell you how. Around the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, after we'd stopped meeting in person, we as a church staff were meeting constantly via Zoom just to try and figure out what all of this looked like, what it meant. How would we care for people? How would we communicate and connect with people? During those meetings, it's not uncommon for my phone to just blow up with calls. So I usually put it on Do Not Disturb. But for some reason, on this particular Tuesday, it was on vibrate. When my phone started to buzz, I tried to silence it. I didn't want to look. But you know how it is. You just can't help yourself. So I pushed the button and saw it was a friend of mine, Sammy. I didn't think much about it. I figured he would call again later. See, Sammy and I have been friends for over 25 years, the last 20 of which he spent in prison. He and I lived completely crazy and out of control lives. Lives that, while still connected, ended in some very different places. See, Sammy was serving a life sentence. We've stayed in touch over the years, and he will always be one of my very best friends. To be honest, at that moment, the phone call was kind of a nuisance. I mean, I had a lot of work to do, and I really didn't have time to sit and chat about the not so good old days. We could catch up later, like we always had. Except we couldn't. Just a few days later, my very good friend took his own life. Grief weighed. Devastation on a scale. I started asking questions. What if I had just answered the phone? What if he had reached out again? If only the world wasn't locked down and a million other thoughts swirled around my head and my heart as I fell into a crumpled heap on the couch. I was stunned. I couldn't believe it. Wouldn't believe that my friend, my strong and independent friend, would find himself in a place so desperate, so hopeless, so overcome with grief that he thought this life had nothing more for him. And now, through no fault of his, I was now confronted with my own overwhelming sense of grief because he was gone. No celebration of his life, no flying to see his family and friends so we could share our grief together. The painful and beautiful process put on an indefinite hold until this pandemic is over. See, the situation isn't unique to me. Sure, the situation is clearly different, but our world, our lives, our families, we're surrounded by grief. The grief over a loved one gone. The grief over graduations canceled and jobs lost. Friends distance and separation from at-risk family. Weddings on hold and milestones in life celebrated through the very same screens we used to try and spend less time in front of. Now suddenly our only lifeline to the world outside. Whether we know it or not, whether we admit it or not, we're all grieving something. We're in mourning, collectively, yet separately. So how do we deal with such grief? How do we process and move forward? This isn't one of those situations where we can say a prayer and snap our fingers and it's gone. The grief we feel, the very real and tangible sense of loss, can't be dismissed. But my hope is that through our time together today, we can identify and name our grief, and through it all, begin to overcome it. For me and other followers of Jesus like me, our first step in trying to answer a life question is to see what Jesus did, what he taught, and the truth he left us on the subject. Sure, Jesus didn't have coronavirus, but he didn't have cars or Wi-Fi either. But you can be sure Jesus faced the same trials, struggles, and temptations that you and I face. And the Bible gives us a path to follow if we look. Even if you aren't a follower of Jesus, the wisdom he provides through the pages of the Bible will help you. So lean in And let's take a look at how Jesus overcame grief when it weighed on him. How did he do it? He actually tells us. He said to them, I am deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and stay awake with me. Going a little farther, he fell face down and prayed. See, after Jesus had his last meal with his closest followers, his disciples, when he knows what lies before him, the price he's going to have to pay for you and for me, he was deeply grieved to the point of death. It would have been easy for him to retreat inside himself, to run the other way or be paralyzed by fear. But instead, Jesus goes to the place where he knows he will find strength and comfort. His example is one of the most powerful things we can do when dealing with grief, a dedication to finding God. Maybe this sounds simple to you, but often when we feel ourselves overwhelmed with grief, retreating is our first response. We want to avoid it. It feels like it's consuming us. Leaning in doesn't come natural, but that's exactly what Jesus does. He went to the garden, a place called Gethsemane, and he cried out to God, pleaded with God. Jesus asked God to take his grief if it was his will. And you can too. Cry out to God. He can take it. You don't have to say fancy or eloquent words or read an ancient prayer from a long ago saint. Just do what Jesus did. God, this is awful. God, this is painful. It's almost like Jesus displays what Job said. If only my grief could be weighed and my devastation placed with it on the scales. I think that's what Jesus meant when he said, my soul is grieved to the point of death. But instead of Jesus giving up and instead of him giving in to an almost certain temptation to run away, he fell face down before God. You can too. Whatever you're grieving, all due respect, it can't be worse than pending crucifixion. Fall down before God. Pour out your soul to him. He's God after all. He can take it. I believe that Jesus knew if he was left alone with that grief, it would easily overcome him. So he went to the only one who could ease what was happening inside of him. The only one who could help. But that's not all Jesus did to overcome grief. The scripture said he went on a little further, but his friends were right behind him. You see, he had other people, his people, around him, which is why it's important for us to also work at finding others. Grief was never something that was meant to be gone through alone. Grief has to be witnessed. This is what Jesus modeled for us when Jesus' cousin, John the Baptizer, was arrested and killed. Word traveled to Jesus. And when Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the shore and towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and he healed their sick. He wanted to be alone, spending time finding God. But I think he also knew the value of being together. Even in his grief, he sought to be with other people because there's comfort and strength in presence. This is obvious to us in the way we surround each other in times of loss. Why we've seen our communities and our country come together after tragedies like 9/11. It's why we sit and talk for hours about people who are no longer here. Because something healing happens when we share with one another. This isn't about having all the answers or saying all the right things. It's about being there with someone so you can share your grief with them. This is often an uncomfortable situation for people around because they don't know what to say or do, and they desperately want to help. We fail to understand a couple of things, though. Right now, our entire world is grieving. And presence and comfort are the best ways to help. Spending time listening to all the plans you had for an amazing graduation party or for your child's first birthday. It's not going to magically make those events happen, but it will help you to work through the grief you feel. This can feel almost unattainable in our current situation because we long to sit down over lunch or coffee, to look someone in the eyes, to find comfort the way we used to. But in unprecedented times, God has provided unprecedented measures, ways for us to connect digitally. And forgive me if this sounds archaic, but we can actually have phone conversations. That thing we use for social media and texting, it actually makes phone calls. The kind where two people actually communicate. One of the other important things that we have to do to process through our grief is by finding meaning. There's a story of Jesus raising a man named Lazarus from the dead. And Jesus grieves with the family of Lazarus. He weeps over the passing of his friend. But something happens before that. Something powerful that points you and me to finding meaning. When he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." See, Jesus had just found out that Lazarus is sick and dying. He knows that Lazarus will be okay, that Lazarus will live. But that whole process of grief, Jesus knew there was meaning in it. You may have heard before what's commonly referred to as the 5 stages of grief. This concept was coined by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And if you aren't familiar with them, the 5 stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. There's no order to these. They aren't a map or easy steps. It's not like step 1, step 2, step 3. These are descriptive, not prescriptive. Let me say that again. These are descriptive, not prescriptive. These stages are circular, not linear, meaning we cycle through them more than once. It's a way to help you and me to understand and name how we feel, about normalizing how we feel. And it's a recognition that we are not alone. David Kessler, a grief specialist who coined these 5 stages of grief with Kubler-Ross, has released a book recently called Finding Meaning, the 6th stage of grief. And I believe this is one of the most powerful pieces to lessening grief, not bypassing it. Some of you may be wondering, how can I find meaning in the loss of my husband? How can I find meaning in potential homelessness? How do I find meaning in a graduation that didn't take place? How do I find meaning when normal is gone? See, we don't have control over the reason why we grieve, but we can create meaningful moments in the midst of it. You can't control the fact that your kids aren't in school. And I know that there's grief there for you. I don't want to minimize it. What I am saying is that you can create meaningful moments in the midst of that grief that may have never happened otherwise. And there's meaning there that we should hold on to. I want to make sure I'm clear about this, though. In no way am I saying there is meaning in what happened. That whatever you are grieving happened for a reason. Because I don't believe that to be true at all. But I do believe, with everything that I am, that the meaning is in what we do after. We see this happening all around us as people grieve the loss of normal, the loss of control. They're finding meaning in making masks and feeding people who need food and taking care of healthcare workers and a million other things. I know I won't ever get over the grief that I feel at the loss of my friend. Will the guilt lessen that I didn't answer the phone? I hope so. Will it eventually hurt less when I think of him? Yeah. Do I ever want to not hurt at all? Absolutely not. Because I loved him enough to carry that with me forever. I know you care about your kids, your spouse, your grandkids, your ability to provide, your return to life without fear. I do too. But we have to be willing to acknowledge the grief we feel, to name it, to give it some air, if we're ever going to move forward from here. And we can find hope in the fact that we don't have to do it alone. The righteous cry out, and the Lord hears and rescues them from all their troubles. The Lord is near the brokenhearted. He saves those crushed in spirit. God will be with us. God will comfort us. And He wants to use the church to help make that happen. Overcoming grief isn't a box we get to check. It's a lessening. A journey through the valley. But here's the thing. The valley, it's real. For many of us, the valley is here and now. You're in it. You look back at the way things used to be 2 months ago, and it's behind you. You look ahead, and the meaning and the understanding and the movement towards normal is ahead. But right now, right here, you are in that valley. It's where you are. It doesn't feel good. It hurts. Maybe you're crying out. Maybe your heart is broken and you're afraid and empty. Here's what I know. God's promise is true. He is near. He will save. And the beauty of His presence is that when we stop distracting ourselves, when we don't have to pretend, when we acknowledge our grief and allow it to breathe, whether we're crying out and shouting or sobbing and writing in a journal, maybe even telling a trusted friend, when we accept that we are hurting, something beautiful happens. The Old Testament writer of the 23rd Psalm says, "Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." You see, if we allow it to do its work, grief is one of the greatest teachers. Most of us can look back at a time when the most difficult, awful times in our lives have actually been the ones in which we've learned the most. And as we follow Jesus, In the middle of our grief and despair and pain, we have an opportunity to experience His presence like never before. We call Him Savior. I think that's a pretty powerful reality when we're in the place where we need to be saved. And the overwhelming pain of loss and hopelessness of our grief puts us there. It's not okay, but it's real. And the gift we have in the middle of grief is that God is with us. And we can experience that truth and understand it now like no other time. There's a song called "It Is Well With My Soul." It's often sung at funerals. See, the truth is, in times of grief, it is not well when it comes to our circumstances. Pain is real. Grief is real. Loss is real. But beyond our circumstances is a place where we find meaning. And that is a matter of the soul. Experiencing the presence of God, leaning into Jesus as our Savior, discovering that He really is with us in the valley. That is what allows us to sing, "It is well with my soul." We can declare that right now, acknowledging and owning our grief and simultaneously trusting the healing work of Jesus in our soul.